You know, I have to say, I've had a fascinating journey with writing my review for Ummagumma, and it's a perfect example of how doing a bit of research can really help amplify your understanding of something. Like, here was my initial copy that I was going to lead off with. I don't know what's worse, having to review this album or the amount of hipster comments I'm going to get defending it just for the sake of its experimental nature. Go back to your country and western, idiot. With its simplistic lyrics and rhythm you can actually understand. Okay, if this is meant to be a nod to the Blues Brothers, I will be very impressed.
Oh, we got both kinds. We got country and western.
While More felt like a small step forward, showing the band's future, Ummagumma, or at least the studio disc, felt like a huge step backwards. I stand by that statement to a degree, but in reading about Ummagumma and its cultural impact, this may very well be the most important album they put out, even if it's one that I nor any member of the band really enjoys. I'm not exaggerating, the band hates this album. Roger has referred to it as a disaster, and I think Nick said it best.
I think Ummagumma was, in a way, probably a failed experiment, and quite an interesting one. You could say the significant thing was that we didn't do it again.
And yet, at the time, the album sold fairly well. It was their first album to chart in the US, and even got some praise from critics, proving there was life for Pink Floyd after Syd Barrett. So why is this exactly? Well, let's backtrack a bit. It's fair to say they were still directionless at this time, but Floyd did have some unique music written. The Embryo, recorded before this record, and never released on an official album, is an infinitely more listenable piece of music. It's not their best, but hearing them jam together is always an engaging listening experience. But instead, the band decided that each band member would create one half of a record side by themselves without involvement from anyone else. Yeah, I don't know. Now, this could at least be passable. Rick could do his jazz piano thing, Dave could do a blues guitar bit, similar to what they did on More, but they went straight for the avant-garde approach.
A lot of the time, it would just be like plonky noises.
Of course, avant-garde albums were being listened to in the 60s. They can be an acquired taste for sure. But as much as I tried to keep an open mind while listening to Ummagumma, it really was a chore to sit through. I do like the cover, a unique Drosty effect where all the band members have switched places. Funny enough, this would be the last time they would include a picture of themselves on the cover art. And thankfully, Pink Floyd had the good sense to include a live disc, which is by far the best thing on this double album, and the section critics highlighted. It's not quite as well recorded as something like Cream's Wheels of Fire, but this would be their only live audio release for years. For me, the most interesting listen is this incarnation of Astronomy Domine with Dave's voice and guitar. It's ultimately not as good as Syd, but it's fascinating to hear his interpretation, and the jam is very dynamic. I'm guessing they started off with one of Syd's songs, feeling that they still needed to tie into his legacy. But honestly, I'm glad they elected to stop performing his material shortly after this, because it's just better to hear them perform their own songs.
It's an instrumental we did some time ago, and it's called Careful With That Axe, Eugene.
This was long considered the highlight of this album, and I'm convinced it's single-handedly responsible for this album's success. While the original B-side is good, much like the songs on Saucerful, it really found its groove live. Dave gets to stretch out without having to stand in Syd's shadow with his synchronized guitar soloing and scat singing. But it's Roger's whispering building up to his signature inhale scream that creates so much tension and defines this classic. I still don't know what Eugene did with that axe. While I like this version's ghost-like melodies, it does go on a little long. Ultimately, Careful With That Axe, Eugene would be tooled just a little bit more before its final form was put to tape. And I pretty much feel the same way about the other two tracks, though Saucerful of Secrets has really re-envisioned its Celestial Voices section into a more dynamic prog rock instrumental. Set the Controls also has some of my favorite improvised moments on the album, but I don't like that it fades out before reaching the ending. I might be biased because I first heard Live at Pompeii before this album, and I still consider that concert the superior performance. We'll get to it. Alright, let's discuss the studio disc. It starts off with an instrumental 4-part piece from Rick, which is probably most in line with that psychedelic experimentation concept. I believe he was the most enthusiastic about this idea. The first part is the best, featuring soundscapes on the Mellotron, before Rick dives into some pretty nice piano playing, progressively getting more atonal as the piece continues. It's clear that Rick is most familiar with that free jazz concept, but whereas those records benefit from the band playing off each other, this sounds more like studio tinkering, and even Rick himself would call it pretentious. Though it should be noted that some of these soundscapes would be incorporated into their later albums. Hell, they're even better heard on this album's live tracks. Roger's up next with the most conventional song on the album, Grantchester Meadows. And I don't like this song, and I think it pales in comparison to the material he wrote on More. It's another attempt to write a Syd Barrett number. The lyrics are trite, Roger doesn't sing it particularly well. Honestly, I want to go back to Rick's piano tinkering every time I hear it. This is really one of the only pieces that would be retained live, but thankfully it didn't stick around too long. And then there's several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave and grooving with a pict. Yeah, that's the title of the song. It's not a bad concept, using vocal effects and tape loops in a percussive sort of way, I guess kind of similar to Power Talk H. Roger certainly is great at making those animal noises, but it goes on for 5 minutes and gets old fast. Although, I do have to admit, hearing Roger yell at the end in an Irish brogue is kind of funny.
Never shall it get me a layer.
There's even a nod to Hendrix's The Wind Cries Mary, but it's still really not worth it. Dave's up next, and considering he never really wrote songs on his own, he was the most hesitant about this project. There's 3 pieces that make up The Narrow Way. Thankfully, part 1, kind of an acoustic Zeppelin track, is to my ear the most listenable part of this disc. And would you believe it's shorter than several species jerking off with a pict? Part 2 consists of more soundscapes, while part 3 is the closest we get to an actual Pink Floyd song. It's impressive that Dave plays all the instruments, but it's still not a great track, and it's another one where it's hard to hear the vocals. Last but not least is Nick. Once again, that's his wife Lindy playing flute. Hey, you're supposed to do it yourself. That's cheating! Nick says in his book he wanted to try a more unique approach to the conventional drum solo, but honestly, I would have preferred just to hear him play a Ginger Baker-style drum piece. You know, I've had friends attempt a Pink Floyd marathon, get to this point, and then just give up, concluding that maybe Pink Floyd's body of work isn't as solid as they were led to believe. And that's the biggest problem with this album. Unless you're a hardcore lover of avant-garde music, Ummagumma just feels like a waste of time. I mean, Sid's Madcap Laughs came out right after this album, and while it's not really my thing and was difficult to record, it's so much more interesting and better representative of that experimental spirit. But if there's one big takeaway from comparing these two albums, it's that they are not the same. For everything that Ummagumma does wrong, if there's one thing it does right, it's clear the obstructed path left by Syd Barrett's departure so that Pink Floyd can move forward. It was a bold move on the band's part. Throw everything to the wall, no pun intended, and see what sticks. And credit to them for quickly realizing this wasn't the right direction, and also picking out the elements that did work. I think it's safe to say that had they not created this disaster, they might not have gotten the momentum to create Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here. But in terms of the music, I still have to judge this album critically, and even with some of the good bits in the live disc, Ummagumma gets a bad fish.
Kill the monster!
While I don't really consider there to be an essential track from this album, the live rendition of Careful With That Axe, Eugene is their best showing as a full performance. Also, it is interesting to hear Dave's interpretation of Astronomy Domine, and there are some great improvisational moments on Set the Controls and Saucerful of Secrets, but considering the Pompeii versions are coming, none of these live renditions are essential listening. This really is an album you can skip, and honestly a prime candidate for their worst album. Fortunately, we are about to head into a new decade, so we'll catch up with Pink Floyd then.